everybody to the Pre-Symposium workshop entitled Designing Effective Preventions, Interventions, and Considerations in Clinical Trials. On behalf of the COBR on opioids and overdose in Rhode Island, and the West Virginia Clinical and Translational Science Institute, the West Virginia IDEA Network of Biomedical Research Excellence, the Rural Drug Addiction Research COBR in Nebraska, and the Center for Addiction and Disease Risk Exacerbation at Brown University in Rhode Island, we would like to welcome you to this symposium on substance use research. So my name is Judith Feinberg. I'm a professor of behavioral medicine and psychiatry. Took me a minute to remember that. At West Virginia University, and this is my trusty sidekick, Max. And just a few reminders before we start. This session is being recorded and we'll send an email to all the registrants. And no, you can't corral now, or you have to go down on social media. That's what happens sometimes when the recording is available. Also, this session is a webinar, so attendees will be muted. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions, and we'll try to answer them as time allows. So I'm very excited to quiet my dog, Max, and to introduce today's speakers. We have three experts joining us today across a range of disciplines: Dr. Melissa Walls, Dr. Latrice Montgomery, and Dr. Todd Davies. So we'll take a minute now to do some brief introductions of our panelists. And I'll start with you, because you're in my upper left-hand corner here, Dr. Walls. Would you please briefly tell us about your background, what your research areas are, and what your experiences have been in intervention and prevention design and clinical trials?
Sure. And while I speak, Judith, my friend Henry might land in my lap. So this might be the dog webinar. I don't know. We'll find out. But bonjour, everyone. Hello. Mimingwan Indishinakas Magizi Duadam. I'm speaking to you in Ojibwe, which is my mother's side of the family's tribal group, which is up here in Minnesota. And we span Wisconsin, Ontario, a little bit into Michigan. On my dad's side of the family, I'm a German-Swedish mix, and I'm coming to you today from Duluth, Minnesota, where I am the director of the Great Lakes Hub of the Johns Hopkins Center for Indigenous Health. So you might be thinking, Johns Hopkins, Minnesota? No, Hopkins is in Baltimore, but I was able to work out a situation in 2019 where we could open physical facilities in Minnesota in order to do health equity research in collaboration with my tribe and many other tribes in the region. And so that'll be part of what I talk about today. Briefly, I'm an associate professor of American Health at Hopkins. I'm a co-director of our center overall. And for the past 20 plus years, I've been doing health equity research, intervention and prevention science, and a few clinical trials here and there with tribal nations. So we operate under a model called CBPR or TBPR, community-based or tribally based participatory research, where our primary goal is to equalize power imbalances and move towards an anti-colonial research agenda, which is similar to anti-racist, but a little different in terms of a settler colonial society that we all live in here in the US. I'm really honored to get to work with tribes and elders in the region. I think some of the smartest people on the planet are in communities and just don't get elevated to these whatever we call these degrees we have, PhDs and MDs. And I'll be happy to share lots more as we go through the panel today. Miigwech, thank you for having me. Oops, Judith, muted.
Unmute myself. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. And Dr. Montgomery, it's your turn.
Sure, thank you. I appreciate the invitation to be here today. I'm excited to be on the panel. So I'm Latrice Montgomery. I am a licensed clinical psychologist in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm also an adjunct associate professor at the University of Cincinnati Department of Psychiatry, and also recently accepted a position as the director of clinical research at RIA Health, which is an online addiction treatment program for alcohol use disorder. And so my research is primarily focused on culturally based interventions, specifically around cannabis and tobacco, and interventions, social media interventions as well for young Black adults, adolescents, and young adults. And so I'm also a member of the Ohio Valley Node of the United Clinical Trials Network. And so I'm happy to talk about my experiences in using social media to develop interventions, as well as working with young Black adults in developing interventions.
Terrific. And last but not least, Dr. Davies.
Oh, I certainly think I'm the least of this group here, but I'm the associate director of research for the Division of Addiction Science at Marshall University. You know, I started out life as a bench researcher. I did a lot of I started from the pharma side, actually doing designing trials, you know, identifying measures, those kinds of things, and then moved down to here to Marshall later on to run the operational side of clinical trials. Got involved in addiction research and just sort of fell in love with the communities that sort of pull together under in those populations. My research focuses a lot on neonatal abstinence syndrome of a variety of substances, but particularly now is with the opioid withdrawal syndrome. And our lab focuses a lot on identifying functional outcomes for people as they're trying to seek recovery in various ways. So we look a lot at the HPA, the hippocampal pituitary adrenal axis, and identifying neurologic barriers to people getting to the healthiest place they want to be. You know, so we look a lot at cortisol. We look at epigenetic markers. We look at things like working memory and how it functions and how it creates a barrier to overall addiction. To the purpose being, can we identify better measures to be able to really look at what success is for people and allow people to get to a better, stronger life. I've done some rural work here in West Virginia. So we work with populations that are, you know, they're poor, they're disparate, they have a lot of barriers to them. But it also is I mean, it's incredibly rewarding work to be able to work with these populations and see these people who have come through, you know, traumas that a lot of us can't even imagine to really live fulfilling lives.
Great, thank you. Well, we have a terrific panel with an extraordinary range of interests and expertise. I think this is going to be a very exciting session. So let's get started. I'm going to start with a question that's very near and dear to my own heart because it's something I've struggled with a lot in my own work. And what I'm going to suggest is that the panelists just all unmute and just speak up. And, you know, rather than my having to call on people. So here's my first question for you. How can we design preventions and interventions that lend themselves to sustainability? You know, it's one thing to have grant or, you know, some form of funding support to do the work, but then how do you ensure that it lives on past that period of funding?
Well, I guess I'm unmuted, so I'll go first. Well, there's a number of ways. First off, you know, I mentioned a little bit before in my introduction, making sure you've got the right measures for your whatever trial you're doing, making sure you're measuring the right thing is absolutely critical. And then it's a matter of, you know, what is the what are you building to, right? So if you can measure success in a way that can be measured by because Judith, you know, the clinical enterprise and the behavioral health enterprise often measure things very different ways. And so we really have to find things in which we can clearly identify when we design the trial, where we can clearly identify in both the behavioral health arm and in the medical arm that this is a successful intervention. And then we can make the argument for, you know, reimbursement of whatever the finding needs to be if we want to move that into the clinical realm.
Okay, so you're thinking of it in terms of getting funding, having the evidence that will enable funding to be spent by insurers and other organizations like that.
Yeah, for when we're talking about long-term sustainability, you know, you may have to couple a couple grants on top of that to get there, but I do think that for me that tends to be the overall goal.
Okay. Melissa.
Yeah, I think about this, I guess, in similar and different ways. Over time, I've come to think in like a multi-level framework about this. So first and foremost for us is sustainability of a program within the community we're partnering with, or within the tribe, or even the entire cultural group we're partnering with. So this could be, you know, ensuring that a program has legs after a study ends, so that people are not left in the dust, you know, sort of like, oh, this thing was really cool and now it's not there anymore. And the only way I've seen that work well, and even then doesn't always work well, is to ensure from the beginning that your research team and governance process as researchers is co-created by the community itself. And again, I throw back to like community-based participatory research as an orientation for that. And for us, that means that we have co-leadership from community research councils, and along the way are kind of embedding programs within health and human service units or existing structures, and collaborating with tribal leaders or city leaders to make sure that once this is done, as long as it worked okay and didn't hurt anybody, here's a way that we could sustain it into the future. So that's within a community. Once there's enough evidence that a program seems to be working well, the second issue that I've grappled with, and a reason I moved from my prior university to Hopkins, was how do you now scale and share outside of the community you were working with, or outside of the clinic you were working with? And so this is where packaging, scaling procedures. So how are you manualizing? Are you putting things online so they're accessible? How are you packaging things so that they're available to other communities? And are you making space for technical assistance to answer basic questions as people try to pick up various interventions or treatment programs? And then third, this is, Todd, where I think I'm thinking similarly to you, is policy change. So for things to really, truly be sustainable. So in our space, for example, traditional indigenous approaches to healing may not have the quote unquote Western scientific evidence base that other, you know, programs that have been supported by clinical trials do. But they have thousands of years of experience that they're effective. And so how can we kind of build up enough types of evidence so that policymakers will pay attention to us? And this is where engaging with people like CMS and leaders and various White House administrations, I've seen it kind of unfold, so that policy change and then billing codes can be created, and you can sustain things in a modern system, even beyond communities. So within community, outside community, and then widespread scaling, I think there's different layers of sustainability to think about.
You know, and Melissa, that's a phenomenal point, and it really goes to show when you're getting evidence, you need evidence that is going to convince the medical community, that's going to convince the policy community, that's going to convince the community that's going to, you know, utilize this intervention. And so when you're making that design, taking those viewpoints into account and saying, okay, what kind of evidence are we going to need to move these different pieces so we can have a sustainable program is really, really important.
Yeah,
I agree with.
Oh, go ahead, Latrice.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I definitely agree with the things that both Dr. Walls and Dr. Davies have mentioned, and especially the piece about involving the community, because I know to speak for myself as a scientist, I have all these great ideas about what an intervention should look like, but oftentimes when you talk to folks, sometimes it's completely different than what you have in mind and even what's in the literature. And so making sure that the interventions that we're implementing are actually resonating with the communities that we're building them with. And I don't want to say for, but actually with. And so that's a really important piece to sustainability. And another piece is around understanding mechanisms of change. I think that has been, you know, valuable, because naturally, especially in the social media world, platforms change, so many things change it, all the time, but kind of understanding what the key features are can help me to adapt and adjust and, move it to other platforms or, make different changes to it, but kind of keep the core of, what's actually effective for the population.
So I want to chime in because, I started my career in HIV research, and a famous saying came out of that, which is nothing about us without us. So I think a very important shift in the last 10 or more years has been to include, the population of interest, the people in whom you're trying to prove that an intervention or a prevention works, and the community that you hope will benefit from it. And I think that has really grown legs. That's really a very important thing to do, because I think that gets away from the problem of people thinking, well, these folks came from outside and told us what to do, and what do they know about us? And I imagine that that is the case in everybody's sphere of activities, right? I'm sure that is true. Melissa, you're nodding your head. And among tribes, and I think certainly among racial and ethnic and sexual and gender minorities. And that's really true in rural communities in West Virginia, where I now done a lot of work in the past 8 years. That there's this sense that some city slickers are going to come in and tell us what to do, and what do they know about, how we live. So I think that's very important. I think dissemination, several of you talked about getting the word out. I think dissemination is very important. And policy change, I think the next step in policy change is advocacy. Is taking your results and not only sharing them with the research community and the community of interest, but also at the state and federal levels to go and, essentially lobby. Because the one thing that has always been problematic for me is finding the resources to sustain an intervention that has worked really nicely, and now the grant is over. And those resources typically often have to come from some governmental entity, whether it's local, state, or federal. And so and that you can do a lot of advocacy, but then you've got to convince people to write a bill and, support a bill and get it passed. And I think for the work that I've been doing in opioid use disorder and the infections that result from injection drug use, I think that's really been a challenge. But great suggestion.
I'm in the substance use disorder world too, and one of the things when we talk about sort of this patient-centered, we can get lazy about it if we don't watch ourselves. And so what happens is we build these coalitions, and we start, so we talk to the doctors, and we talk to the nurses, and we talk to the therapists, and we talk to the peer recovery coaches. But what happens even with the peer recovery coaches that have that lived experience, as they go through and as they start living a healthier life, even their point of view will change. And so, we always make sure we stay connected with the patients who are going through it at that time, as we're designing and as we're developing it, to maintain that breadth of point of view as best we can. I've had a couple of times where I've designed a study, and I've talked to the peer coaches, and I've talked to all the clinicians, and I said, okay, we've got a study that's going to work. And then I sit in a group and I ask the patients, and they're like, no, that's not going to work at all. We have one study that we didn't recruit anybody on because the moms in this rural West Virginia town were afraid of, we were recruiting pregnant women. It was a non-interventional study. It was minimally invasive, but the propensity for preeclampsia and losing their child in that area where the health was quite poor for all of them was so severe in their heads, and that fear was so strong with them. They wouldn't do anything out of the ordinary because it would jinx them. And even their providers, at that particular site didn't understand that. And so it was our communication with them that allowed us to sort of figure that out and make the alterations.
Right. So that really comes back to that whole point of nothing about us without us.
Mhm.
So moving on that, along that line of inquiry, what has your experience been, and what are your suggestions for building strong partnerships with communities? What has worked for you? What has not worked? What's your advice for others?
My first thought to that is being involved in the community in ways that are non-research. And so going to community events, being involved in, just knowing people and connecting with people outside of the research. And so I found that to be really helpful. I have the advantage of working in communities where, in a lot of communities where I've actually grew up. And so there's that piece of it, but then also making, new connections and being exposed to new communities and really just going in as Latrice, not as Dr. Montgomery coming with, this IRB form to sign with, but just coming as Latrice and, just being in the community, I found has been extremely helpful for making partnerships, networking and communicating with folks. And then also, I think another important piece of it is kind of, and this is part, and it's actually easier said than done, the part of communicating with and working with the community and building interventions, designing interventions. And although I think it's the best thing to do, but sometimes it can be difficult because there is this, part of, especially with research, there's all these regulations and rules and certain things need to be done a certain way, but it may not always resonate with how things happen in the community. And so kind of doing an education piece about, this is kind of what's happening on the research end. And then I'm also learning about what's happening in the community and how might we come together to actually build something that works for both of us and that we can, actually push it through an IRB and push it through all the regulatory issues. So that we can actually develop these interventions. And so I think the number one thing I would say is just the patience. It takes time, and it takes a real, actually caring about the population, caring about the community, and people can pick up on that, very easily on kind of what your stance is and where, the energy that you bring to the table. So I definitely think just going in with time, with patience, and being willing to work with people and talk with people, and being able to say, I'm wrong on this, or I didn't quite get this right, or this is my thought about it, but it doesn't resonate with the community. So we have to, sometimes it's an adjustment to think in that way outside of kind of traditional research, where we kind of go in as like, we're the experts, we know exactly all the pieces, and it's not always that way, and especially when you're doing community-based research.
Well, for really big researchers, we don't know anything, right? That's so Dr. Montgomery is absolutely right. There's three things that we look at. One, they have to see you. We talk about, you hear the phrase a lot, you meet them where they are, but what does that mean? It means they have to see you in their world. Right. The second thing is, and this is absolutely critical, do what you say you're going to do. If if you go in there and you say, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and then you don't do it, your credibility is shot. You have to do whatever you say you're going to do. That's what you have to do. And the third thing that we really try to emphasize is make sure you tell them all the bad things that could happen. Because if it's easy to tell them the good things and the excitement, and you're excited about, people participating in things, but if you don't tell them the bad things, they will not believe you.
I would
Melissa.
say, oh yeah. I would say that I think it's important to first acknowledge that even despite progress, the modern and actually the origins of academia were not built to be inclusive of communities. Actually, they were built to exclude communities and be very elitist and very, you know, these few European men are the ones with the knowledge and the rest of you go back to your wherever you came from. And so I recognize that this is a struggle for all of us to fit within these systems and get this to work. The good news is we now have 20 years of remarkable scholarship on the effectiveness of equity and truly collaborative community-based participatory research approaches and orientations to cite, to use the systems of academia to push for, I think, the inputs that are necessary for true authentic collaboration to happen, to be supported. So examples of this, I was really fortunate to get to work with a team and members of the National Institutes of Health to create a report on all of the issues we're talking about with regards to specifically American Indian and Alaska Native research, and how metrics of success in this type of work might look different. It might not be a whole bunch of publications. It might be a lot of community meetings. It might be time to build rapport and relationship. It's an approach to research that's relational, not transactional. And as Dr. Montgomery was talking about, I think many of us are members of the communities we work with. And so, you know, this veil of objectivity that science preaches just isn't a thing. And so really naming it and talking about it. And then along the way, creating models for all of the kind of inputs and intermediate processes that lead to success in terms of health equity being the outcome and the goal, whether it's we do trials in the spaces of opioid and substance use research or diabetes, whatever the condition may be. And so anyway, there's just a lot of models out there now and a lot of ways for us to justify to the powers that be in our institutions that, yeah, it's going to take longer than you thought to build up this trial. Time is a massive investment that we need to have to do deeply authentic community work. And that time is short compared to all the time we've wasted in intervention and prevention science, where the results didn't have any external validity because we didn't put that time in on the front end and throughout the process.
Yeah, I think that is so on target. And what our struggle is then is working within the confines of getting funding for some finite period of time, and it's not enough time. And I will just share with you one of the most intense frustrations I have in doing the kind of clinical research that I do is somebody's requirement, whether it's NIH or some other body, requirement for consent forms that go on for 10s and 20s of pages, and that are really even, just it just strikes me as being the opposite of obtaining informed consent, because what they require you to do is so arcane and so you really you need more than a college education to even parse these things, no matter how much you simplify the language. And sometimes I have simplified the language and had the consent form rejected because it somehow wasn't medical enough, which I thought was crazy. And so that within our own group of people who want to move the knowledge base along by doing valuable community-centered research, our own institutions are part of the barrier. I don't know a way around that, but I've experienced that and I feel it very strongly. Really, here's an idea. I once had to do a consent form for a trial where some of the risks were that in monkeys, they were born without a brain, with a single eye or an abnormally small brain. And I put that in English, like, in monkeys, this happened. And it got turned down because they wanted me to say anencephaly. I'm thinking most medical students don't know what anencephaly is. Now, how are the people I want to consent going to understand that? So, these are obstacles for us, that continue, and the timing of things and the very rigid requirements that research imposes on you sometimes. Let me move on to another piece that I think is important for people to understand, and that is, what are the components of the research that you've done that are the most time consuming or require the most resources, and do you have ideas about how to make those less of an obstacle?
Well, I think we've been talking about it. For us, it's maintaining that relationship with the community outside of the clinical trial, right? So every time you get a clinical trial, we have a population and we want to do research with this population, and we have something that we think will benefit them. If you're not maintaining that relationship, and Dr. Wall sort of alluded to this, it takes a long time to build that trust up and build that relationship up. You can't do it every time you get a clinical trial and start from zero and go back. You have to have a consistent maintenance of having those relationships, of having that trust inside the community. And because once you have that, and going to what you were talking about with the consenting, getting our the individuals in my institution to understand that the consenting process is a conversation. It's not, I'm going to read this document to you and you're going to trust me and you're going to sign it. And that's not what informed consent is. It's really, can I have that conversation with you? Can I understand where your concerns are about participating in the trial, where your concerns are about your health? But you have to trust me going into that, right? You have to understand that there's a responsibility on our end as researchers to take care of our participation, and trust that we appreciate and keep that. I think that's the hardest thing, and by maintaining that, you can avoid those longer timelines to get started.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I can share that. I think when, it sounds like some of you work in rural areas where this is definitely true, but if you're not working in like a medical center or a clinic where there's one confined setting, there's such a lack of understanding of just how expensive mileage and personnel and, just getting basic access to technology in very rural and remote areas can be so expensive. Buying Starlinks, I guess now, I'm not endorsing that particular person's brand, but getting internet, right, like is a really tricky thing. And so I think there's widespread understanding in biomedical research about equipment costs, and those are expensive. And so startup packages for biomedical scientists tend to be higher than for behavioral scientists, and not an understanding about the costs, the financial costs, and the resource of time investments, as we've been talking about, that also require enumeration, that require a startup package to build up supports for community events and to invest in those and to show your face, as we've been saying. But I'm going to say something else that has popped up since the pandemic, and I'm sure we all would commiserate on this. It is the experience that NIH grants, you go in with a budget and then you get funded and you get a budget cut. And then you just have to figure out how to do that work with this budget cut. And, we all figure out ways to do that. But since inflation issues have popped up, I know that we really struggle to keep up with wages and, even honoraria for elders and things, and nurses, clinical staff. I mean, the costs have jumped through the roof, and yet the budget at NIH has remained the same or has lessened. And I sit on council at NIDA, and I know in even public session, we talk about this, and whether or not budgets will increase, we don't know. We have issues with the government shutting down, who knows, but this is just a struggle. So now we continue to try to do more and more with less and less. And I'm not sure how to fix that.
Yes,
Latrice?
I certainly agree with all the points that have been raised. And I know for me, just kind of getting back to the consent process, one of the things that and issues that I've ran into is just around kind of explaining, especially whether it be to IRB or even to funders, that there are additional steps that I often have to take in research, because it's not like traditional work where there just may be, like a consent form that's presented and, it is a conversation, but our conversations and a lot of the conversations that I have to have with a lot of my participants and a lot of folks that I work with are not so much about the study, but just about research and about the fact that, because, the syphilis studies and what will happen to me, and especially doing research on cannabis, it's like, are you the police? Are you connected to them in any way? Like those kind of just, I have to really be, like to spend a lot of time in that area on top of just the general, what regulatory bodies want us to include in these consent forms. And so I think explaining that and realizing that it takes a lot of time to do that, and even throughout the study. So one example is that I actually, this is something I learned in a study that I just recently did, where I had young Black adults come into a medical setting, and I was working part of a methadone clinic. And so, but I was focusing on cannabis use, and I was actually just going to do the individual interviews with the young Black adults that were coming in. But I actually lost a lot of people, and people were telling me, they're like, well, hey, why am I coming to a methadone clinic? Like, I don't want to be seen, coming there. Like, I'm just smoking a little weed. Like, I'm not I'm not using opiates. I'm not, doing these things. And so, and then the fact also being associated with my particular university, it's like, I don't know that I can trust that I can come to come there and talk about cannabis use and know that I can leave there, and not have any issues. And so I actually ended up moving kind of my entire operation to partnering with the community program that it actually had a lot of credibility within the community, predominantly Black community. And after that, I actually had a wait list to where I actually had to turn people away. And so just that quick, switch that made a big difference. But again, it costs more money. So having to explain to funders, why are you switching, settings? Why is it? And so, there are these additional pieces that we have to think about that aren't just, part of the science, so to speak.
Right. So my experiences, I think, line up very, very closely to all of yours. Sometimes NIDA cuts your budget so to the bone, you can almost not do the work, which is very frustrating. Working in rural communities takes an enormous amount of time and energy, right? Just to go from A to B. And it's really, that's part of the obstacles to care, whether it's healthcare or behavioral health care, that, that's an obstacle for the people we want to help, is they don't have a way to get from A to B, and getting from A to B takes a lot of time. And there's no public transportation, right? There's, you just can't do that without a car, and cars and gas and all those things cost a lot of money. But when you have your staff driving all around a very rural state, that takes an enormous amount of time and energy. And yet, people, funders want to know, where's that money going? Well, takes a lot of gasoline to get from, Morgantown, 6 miles from Pennsylvania, to to Bluefield on the Virginia border. Just takes a lot of time to get one end of the state to the other. And I think the other issue is that aside from the time that people often just don't understand, not only the timeline for getting into a community and getting started and getting the work done, and the time it takes to just travel around to different sites. I think the other big obstacle and the thing that's expensive is exactly what Dr. Montgomery was saying, which is that, or maybe it was Dr. Walls, or maybe it was both of you, is that, salaries change. And in a competitive market, it's hard to find good research staff. And you need to be able to do that and also, offer them, appropriate support for their healthcare and their other needs. And that, I think that a lot of this just gets lost at the funding end, which, it clearly is frustrating to all of us.